when you see an argument with a seemingly absurd conclusion, there's two ways to take that. One way is to take it as, oh my gosh, the seemingly absurd conclusion is not absurd at all. The other way to take it is to say, what this does is it shows that there's something wrong with one of the premises. Let me give an illustration of that kind of way of thinking. So here's an argument that looks like it has quite good premises and is valid, but has a conclusion. Well, I invite you to think about whether the conclusion is good. Famous old argument in philosophy. So it concerns heaps of sand. So the issue is whether or not there would be heap on this table if I put 1 or 2 or 3 grains of sand close together, piled up on the table. So we're asked to consider, would there be a heap there if I dropped 1 grain? Would there be a heap there if I dropped 2 grains? Would there be a heap there if I dropped 3 grains? OK, and here's the argument. Premise 1. 1 grain does not make a heap. Premise 2. For any n, if n grains do not make a heap, then n plus 1 grains do not make a heap. Conclusion, 20 billion grains do not make a heap. OK, this is a valid argument. Premise 1 looks pretty good. I mean, I drop a grain of sand on here. Would I have a heap would there be a heap of sand on the table? No. Clearly, 1 grain of sand doesn't make a heap. We're good so far. Premise 2 looks pretty good too. Suppose I've got a bunch of sand on the table. And suppose I say, I'm accurate in saying this, there's no heap on the table. Can I add a grain and say, now there's a heap? That's not how heaps work. You can't turn a non-heap into a heap just by adding a speck of sand. Right? There isn't a magic speck such that that makes the difference between non-heap and heap. Right? So premise 2 looks pretty good. And it's a valid argument. So, right, it seems like the conclusion must be true. How do we respond when we're faced with an argument like this? I mean, the conclusion is that I've got 200 billion grains of sand here. I haven't got a heap. Right? What do we do with that? You might think, well, one thing you could do is you could say, I'm convinced, actually, that, that 200 billion of sand don't make a heap. There are no heaps of sand in the world. The world doesn't contain any heaps. Right? That would be to embrace the conclusion. I mean, you believe each of the premises. You see the argument's valid. You're like, I've been persuaded. Yeah, it was surprising. I never saw this before I came to a philosophy class. Never occurred to me, but this is finally we've made a discovery. All that stuff about God, it all ended equivocally, But finally, else we've established something, which is that there are no heaps in the world. OK, that is a conclusion that you could come to. I take it it's not the conclusion that you're going to come to. What you're going to think is you're going to think that the conclusion of this argument is so absurd, right, that there must be something wrong with one of the premises. Right? Because remember, if the conclusion is false and the argument's valid, then one of the premises must be false. And probably the dodgy thing that's going on is premise 2, right? I mean, premise 1 is also pretty strong, right? So what this argument is doing is that it's showing that there's something wrong with premise 2. Premise 2 looked good. You kind of sort of slightly nodded along when I kind of got you to try and think about it, but really there's something wrong with it. And this argument shows that there's something wrong with it. This is what philosophers call an argument being a reductio of its premises. And what G.E. Moore said was that the skeptical argument that you have on your handout is a reductio of its premises, just like this one. The conclusion is so absurd that what you shouldn't do is think, yes, no, we don't know anything. Right? We don't know we have hands. No, you should think there's something wrong with one of the premises, and probably the one that looks dodgy is the closure premise, premise 3. That's what Moore says. Any responses?
Well, it seems like the purpose of making premise conclusion arguments in the first place is try to reach conclusions that you wouldn't have otherwise accepted. But if you accept every conclusion that you don't intuitively think is true, then there would be no point in making an argument in the first place.
So that's absolutely yes. So we don't want, if there's going to be anything interesting done by this business of constructing arguments, we've got to say at least sometimes when arguments have surprising conclusions, we don't take the conclusion to be a reductio of the premises. We don't just say, oh, because the argument's surprising, because the conclusion is surprising, there must be something wrong with one of the premises. At least sometimes we are willing to say, oh, we've discovered something really surprising. The conclusion of this argument is true because we're more confident in the premises being true than we're confident that the conclusion is false. And you could say in this case, yeah, we're not more confident that both premises are true, right, than we are that the conclusion's false, because we're entirely confident the conclusion's false, and these look a bit dodgy. But maybe in Moore's case, and the case of the skeptical argument, it's not like that. Indeed, that's what Descartes would have said if he'd had an opportunity to reply many hundreds of years later to Moore. He'd have said this: look, if the conclusion of my argument was that you didn't have hands, right, that really would be crazy, right? But the conclusion of my argument is that you don't know that you have hands. You're not entitled to be certain that you have hands. That's not so crazy. I mean, look how hard knowledge is to get. Remember, knowledge, knowing stuff really required, satisfying all these complicated conditions. And it really required us being able to say we can perfectly rule out the possibility that we're wrong. Maybe it's not so surprising when we understand just how stringent knowledge is, that in fact we don't have very much knowledge of anything. So maybe, in fact, that's not so surprising a conclusion. Not nearly as surprising as the conclusion that you don't have hands, which of course would be crazy.